Kia ora everybody and welcome back to Civilization. I'm gonna have some things on screen throughout the video as we go through this, a Civilization history lesson of sorts, but more importantly, my tier rankings, my ultimate tier rankings for the main series, Sid Meier's Civilization games. I'm gonna be reviewing everything from Civ 1 right the way through to Civ 6. So without any further ado, let's jump straight in to, first and foremost, it has to be Sid Meier's, or as some might call it, simply Civ 1. Okay, Civ 1 released in 1991. It released on MS-DOS on PC. It had an absolute cult status following behind this game. Really, really important to note. And I believe it was later ported to PlayStation and the Super NES, if my mind remembers correctly. Civ 1 started, of course, in 4100 BC, took us through to the year 2100, a very familiar playbook for Civilization 1. As I'm going through and reviewing and rating these titles, I'm going to be considering their impact on the wider franchise, their playability now, and overall, are these games good games? Okay, you won't probably agree with me in every point, but I'm going to have to take Civilization 1 and put it clearly in a B category. S tier being the ultimate best games that you could pick up now and love, you could pick up back then and love. These games were fantastic. A, B, and C ranging from great in my mind to fairly average at C. B being good, solid titles. And then, of course, F tier, reserved for the biggest piles of garbage of all. Next up came Civilization 2, 5 years later in 1996. It took us away from a sort of top-down view and gave us more of a slightly interactive viewpoint with Civ. I think also one of the key distinctions for Civ 2 was that there was sort of more of a focus in Civ 2 than there was in Civ 1 on things like diplomacy, trade, military relationships, so on and so forth. It also had some extensions, conflicts and civilization and test of time, that added sort of more maps and single player benefits to these games. As Civilization 2, I feel like was a fairly solid entry into the franchise, did pave the way forward for some future improvements. I'm going to put it at B tier, purely because Civilization 2 is the game that I have the least experience with, and I don't want to put it anywhere too controversial, because, I can't draw specifically on my individual experiences there. Coming up next, I think it makes a fair amount of sense for us to jump into Civilization 3. This one a bit spicier. Unlike Civ 1 and Civ 2, Civilization 3 was designed by Jeff Briggs. Sid Meiers stepped back at this point and served as director, I believe. Creative director, perhaps. The game introduced a culture as well. We saw sort of the first, I believe, fully fledged edition of culture, and how that could either restrict or allow a city to grow, right? Something that has stuck through the game, throughout the ages, really. It allowed us to sort of establish a sort of a cultural hegemony over other civilizations. It allowed you to push your culture, and really a more peaceful way of winning the game, right? It took us away from strictly a military political simulator and into more sort of wider societal impacts. Civilization 3, I think, is a really fantastic entrance to the game. It did pave the way forward into a more modern Civilization experience as well, although it did only release in 2001, so it's some 20 years old now. I will be putting Civilization 3 as an A-grade Civ game. I think purely because not only was it a fantastic entry into the series, it helped to pave the way for future editions, but actually it's still quite playable to this day, and there's a reasonable community around it, and so I think it stands out a little bit stronger, potentially, than some of the other additions into the franchise. Next up, I'm going to go to Civilization 4. I think that makes sense. Civilization 4 is literally a Grammy Award-winning game, although it was, I believe, for Baba Yetu, its musical soundtrack, rather than the actual gameplay itself. However, I think that any fan of Civilization, old or new, will probably have heard someone at some point in their life say Civ 4 is the greatest Civ game of all time. And let's be real, the game's technical features, the gameplay, the whole experience was and is to this day incredible. It really is. Now, I'm not a huge player of Civ 4. I just want to put that out there. It is absolutely by no means the Civilization game that I've sunk the most amount of time into. I do not consider myself an expert on it in any way. I know a lot more about, for example, Civilization 5 and 6, and even Civ 3, really, than I do about Civ 4. So I'm not giving it my rating or reflection based off personal experience. However, I do know that, again, Civ 4 made big leaps and bounds outside of the military realm, right? 1 and 2, more focused on military. 3, really started to flesh out culture. 4, fleshed out a whole load of mechanics that we take for advantage now, not just in the Civilization franchise, but actually more broadly in strategy games as a whole. Think about the fact that in Civilization 4, non-military units were actually a big feature, with significant improvements to units like settlers who could discover and establish new cities, like spies, espionage, counterintelligence, diplomacy. It was also, of course, the first game to really introduce proper 3D graphics. A welcome upgrade over previous titles. Civilization 4 also received a lot of great DLCs and expansions. It was the first title to really have a solid expansion model and a lot of support after its launch. And of course, couple that with the outstanding community support that still is provided to this day, some 16 years after its release. I really do have to put Civilization 4 as an S-tier Civilization game. It really is fantastic. It's so cheap and accessible these days. The only downside to it, I think, now is its age. It is starting to show its age. It's less compatible, perhaps, with modern systems. It can be difficult to get running. I've had personal experience of having some difficulties running it on a system that really shouldn't struggle. But by and large, still a great game. You can pick it up at a really cheap price, and the community and modding support for it is absolutely outstanding. For many people, Civilization 4 is their best game, and for me, I'm comfortable to put it as an S-tier addition to the franchise. Now I'm going to bounce to something a little bit spicier. It's Civilization Revolution. Came out in 2008. It's a little bit more of an interesting title. So, a majority of Civ games, we know how these end, right? You go to space, you win by culture, domination. Civilization Revolution was more of a console, a toned-down entry into the series, but still an official entry, unlike, say, Alpha Centauri, which was not a main series Civilization game, but considered more of a spiritual spin-off. Still made by Sid Meiers, but not Civ. Now, Civ Revolution released on consoles like the PlayStation 3. I played it on my Nintendo DS. I think it also was available on iOS. And I was going to say Android, but I feel like maybe Windows Phone actually was what it was on. Anyway, it was a dumbed-down version, a stripped-back version of Civilization. In it, you could either form the United Nations Wonder, I think they called it, which you had to sort of capture some points and personalities and wonders around the map, or you could build, I think they called it the Global Bank or the World Bank Wonder as well, by having a lot of gold, and that would allow you to win the game. There were historically great leaders in it, like I can remember playing as Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, but by and large it was a fairly limited experience. For that reason, it's a C tier game for me. And I'm the only reason I'm not ranking it as an F tier is because by design it was meant to be a limited experience, right? This was a PlayStation 3 and Nintendo DS game, and so I am giving it slight credit for that and not putting it as an F tier game, because actually it was like quite fun. But if you want a Civilization experience, it's not the place you should turn to. And for that reason, I'm ranking Civilization Revolution as a C-tier entry into the Civilization franchise. It has to be. I'm sorry. It just has to be. Next up, I think it makes sense that we turn to Civilization 5. Civilization 5 released in 2010, and many people would consider it, much like Civ 4, to be a huge turning point in the Civilization franchise, okay? Square grid maps were replaced with our hexagonal grid that we've grown to know and love. The game felt more realistic. It felt more geographically and politically accurate to real life and to the various conflicts that we know and love throughout history. The combat system in the game was changed, of course. It allowed us to settle settlements, to defend themselves by firing on the enemies from cities. Lots of core, complex gameplay features that were either introduced or really fleshed out. You look at great people, you look at establishing cities, you look at the cultural policy trees, you look at the cultural victory condition, tourism. With Civilization V's Brave New World expansion and God and Kings, we also had the largest roster of playable civilizations, of maps, strategic resources, luxury resources, happiness, you name it. The concepts and gameplay features went on and on and on, and really thanks to those DLC packages. And it is important to note that when I'm reflecting on Civ 5 here, I am reflecting on Civ 5 with religion, with espionage, with the World Congress, Brave New World and God and Kings, all of those features combine in with ongoing support by the community, a huge amount of modding support, not just in single player, but in multiplayer, huge mods like the Lek mod, like Vox Populi, these fundamentally game-changing mods that really took years and years worth of experience. But even if you ignore all of those, it's hard to look past the fact, and I may be slightly biased, but I'm happy to wear that bias with pride, that Civilization 5 is arguably one of the greatest entries into the franchise, if not the greatest. And for that reason, I'll be placing Civilization 5 as an S-tier game. If I could, I would edge it slightly in front of Civilization 4, in fact. I do believe it's a more solid experience. It's old enough now that anybody can access it, almost anybody can play it. It's very affordable and works on most systems because it is just slightly more modern. Civilization 5, I think, is the best entry into the franchise. It's certainly an S-tier entry. Now, following Civilization 5 in chronological order anyway, came Civilization Brave New World, Civilization Beyond Earth. Beyond Earth released in 2014. It was, in many ways, a spiritual successor to Alpha Centauri, which I mentioned earlier. That non-canon 1990s game that came out from Sid Meiers, but not a Civ game. Civilization Beyond Earth was developed really as a sci-fi entry to the franchise, right? It strayed from the historical accuracy of 1, of 2, of 3, and of 4, and of 5. In Beyond Earth, it was solely set in the distant future. As players, we colonized other planets as Earth became uninhabitable, right? So instead of choosing historical leaders and civilizations, our choices were based off space exploration, off future technology, off scientific achievements and credits beyond what we would know right now, hence the title Beyond Earth. It did also have an expansion pack called Rising Tide, which improved diplomatic features in the game and introduced floating cities in water. The DLC actually did improve Beyond Earth, did improve Beyond Earth by quite a bit. However, Beyond Earth was an absolute flop. Its launch was marred with, it's fair to say, quite a bit of controversy. It still isn't really a game that is respected by the community. It strayed, many would argue, too far from civilizations at least somewhat grounded in history and in the history of humankind. It just went too far. It went too far, it went too fast. It didn't capture some of those really core gameplay elements that Civilization players love, and without any real tie to human history beyond sort of, the New Age human sort of twist, it left players wanting more. The mechanics weren't entirely fleshed out, and to be honest, Beyond Earth was absolutely an F-tier experience. And it does pain me to say that because I don't want to rip on it too hard. But it just wasn't a good game. I can't recommend Beyond Earth. Like I say, with the DLC it improved it a bit, but it's still absolutely an F-tier experience. Nobody is turning to Beyond Earth. It's just superseded by PC additions to the franchise that are much better than it, to be honest. And for that reason, Beyond Earth, I'm sorry, you are an F-tier game. Next up, Civilization 6, the most recent addition to the franchise, releasing in 2016, and of course still having DLC content added to it as recently as this year, 2021, with the new Frontier Pass. In between here and there, it had two significant DLC expansions, Gathering Storm and Rise and Fall, both of which were really great additions. Gathering Storm in particular, I would say actually is probably the best DLC that's ever been released in Civilization history in terms of its impact on the franchise, okay? Civ 5's DLC was very impactful as well, and some other ones throughout the history of the franchise, but really, Civilization 6's DLC, particularly Gathering Storm, took Civ 6 from what would probably be around a C-tier, B-tier launch into a solid, high-performing experience. It was a more controversial launch, right? It didn't stray as far as Beyond Earth in that it wasn't set in a distant future with made-up technologies and a weird world that no one could connect with. Civilization 6 was obviously grounded in history, much like Civilization 5 and the previous editions before it. However, it was marred with controversy. Its graphics were controversial, very different from previous editions, for better or for worse. That's up to you, not me. Its gameplay features were somewhat revolutionary to the franchise, perhaps, in terms of war wariness, city loyalties, district placement, city growth, right? We saw a need for fresh water, more intricacies around planning around natural features. DLC made that even more profound with climate change, disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes, sea level rise. Really a much more interactive map and board experience coupled with a newly introduced culture tree. You can see why Civilization 6 really tested the boundaries without isolating most of its players like Beyond Earth did. Civilization 6, I think, reflecting on it as a whole experience, thinking about the anthology and all of the DLC, really is actually a very good game. I was someone who didn't like Civilization 6 on launch, and I can safely say, subjectively, I really enjoy it now. To be honest, I'm very close to putting it at an S tier, but I just can't quite place it there. I just don't think Civilization 6 is quite as impactful, as significant, and I don't think it'll quite necessarily have the longevity of Civilization 4 and Civilization 5. Is it strictly a worse game than them? No. No. And in fact, being the most modern addition to the franchise in many ways probably makes it the most playable, appealing, and appetizing game in the franchise. However, when I reflect on it as a whole, on the whole community experience, on the ongoing support, on what it introduced, on how significant it was to the franchise and to the genre more broadly, I'm going to be ranking Civilization 6 as an A-tier game. Thank you very much for watching me run through these 2, 4, 6, 8 top Civilization games. I have largely reflected, as you can see, on the main series titles with a couple of additions. There are many more games within the wider franchise, including, like I say, Colonization, Alpha Centauri, Test of Time, Alien Crossfire, so on and so forth. I won't be reflecting on all of them, but just these main ones for today. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, I'd really love to hear where you would place things. How would you rank things? I'm sure there'll be lots of people who would rank them differently than me, and maybe one or two the same. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.